Welcome to Brief Encounters. This is our July episode of the Securities Regulation and Enforcement series. My name is Valerie Mirko. I'm a partner at Armstrong Teasdale, and I also chair the firm's Securities Regulation and Litigation practice. And with me is my co-host, William Nelson. William, will you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely, Valerie. William Nelson. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Associate General Counsel for the Investment Advisor Association.
And we have a guest speaker today again, which I'm very excited about. And this is actually going to be our second episode on AI. And William, can you go ahead and introduce our guest, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we're so excited to have Kate Ring from Stash Financial. It's a digital investment advisor. I was looking at your website today, Kate. Looks like you have over 4 billion in assets under management, so very impressive, and over 1 million subscribers. But yeah, so again, so happy to have you on the podcast today. And if you just want to share a few words about Stash before we get started, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, no, thank you both for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So as you mentioned, Stash is an app-based investment advisor. Our goal is to help everyday Americans learn how to save and invest through as little as $5 a week. We have what we call the Stash Way, which is long-term investing using the tools that we provide through our app. So happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Well, Kate, you heard our last episode, our June episode, which was really about the use of artificial intelligence for lawyers and other practitioners and sort of, some opportunities and pitfalls there. And today we're turning our conversation on artificial intelligence to the investment advisor industry more broadly. So sort of as a starting point, Kate, what is the state of AI in the investment advisor industry?
I think it's a really good question because I think it's varied across the industry and it's rapidly changing. If I think back to, conferences and podcasts and things that I've attended and listened to over the past couple of years, there's sort of been this shift from very small use cases, and we've seen some larger firms start using, AI, releasing their own models. And now I'm hearing more and more the question of innovation and helping, advisors give better advice to their clients. And so I think, from a general overall stance, there's more adoption coming more rapidly. And I think it's probably one of the most popular topics that you see about in the news and you hear about at any sort of industry conference or industry conversation. So definitely evolving. I think just like the investment advisor industry, as William can tell you, is so varied in terms of business models and size. I definitely see very different use cases across, my colleagues and what we're doing as well. So best way to say that is it's varied, but it's definitely picking up from an adoption perspective. And I think it's exciting to see what we as an industry will be able to do with the power of the tools in a prudent and responsible way.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And Kate, to your point, I feel like you can't even go to a conference today if you don't talk about AI. So I think that's a really interesting point. But now that you have been in your role now at Stash for around 3 years, can you kind of talk about your journey with artificial intelligence and maybe how your point of view has changed over time?
Yes, no, it's really interesting. And I always like to share this because as a true confession, I started off as a skeptic, as probably a number of folks, who sit in the compliance profession did, not because of, not wanting to innovate, but really around some of the fear around it. And so I can tell you about a year and a half ago when I was approached by one of our co-founders who's sort of leading our AI strategy about creating some tools to interact with clients. I was very much, no, we can't do that. We don't have, regulatory guidance that's great out there. It was also around the time of, PDA rule with the SEC being proposed. And so I not only evolved professionally, but also personally in terms of understanding and kind of getting excited about the power of it. And so definitely have evolved now to where, I sit on and am part of the strategic thinking at the firm in terms of how we're using these tools. And so definitely have evolved from a skeptic to now an enthusiast in a prudent and responsible way.
And let's talk about the opportunities here. And, at Stash in your intro, you really shared with us that Stash's mission is really about democratizing investment advice. And I would think that AI allows you to accelerate that goal.
That's 100% right. If you think about what AI does, right, it sort of, in my mind, democratizes access to information. And so the marriage of our mission with using tools that are out there has really been a very natural evolution for us. And, it helps us get better, more personalized advice to our individual end client users by taking in data that we have, because, we have to have it as an investment advisor, and providing them, we call it our next best action, or providing them some analysis of spending, and to help them really, work through kind of getting over the hurdles that I think a lot of folks who don't have, traditional wealth managers and don't have, your hundreds of thousands of dollars to start with. It really helps kind of break down some of those educational barriers. And we've used the power of AI in our tool, which we call Money Coach, to help our clients answer those questions and be able to feel confident about what they're doing and contributing and investing and growing their wealth.
Yeah, and that's really helpful, Kate. And I think that, unfortunately, as compliance officers, and I know we had recently spoken about how we had switched roles, and I'm a reform CCO, but I think that we also need to look at some of the regulatory risks as well. And obviously, as a digital investment advisor, you're regulated by the SEC. So could you kind of maybe just talk about some of the regulatory risks you see in kind of your day-to-day business using artificial intelligence?
Absolutely. It's a question that, I live with and I, kind of deal with every day, but I have a foundation, right? We are, as you noted, an investment advisor regulated by the SEC. The Investment Advisors Act has been there for quite some time. We take our fiduciary duty very seriously, and every step of the way when building these tools and interacting with our clients, we do it in what we believe is to be in their best interest. And sort of that's our Northern Star, our guiding light. And so when we talk about regulatory uncertainty in this space, of course, I know things will evolve. There's more guidance that's out there. And I know the SEC has had, some of their discussions and panels on this as well, noting that some things may have to be updated. But really, I go back to the foundation of what all investment advisors are held to, and that's doing what's in the best interest of your clients with disclosure of conflict of interest, and really fulfilling that fiduciary duty from day one. And that informs everything that we do, any development that we have, and certainly helps inform any changes that we make or, progression of the tools that we use.
And Kate, what about the supervision piece? I think firms are being including yours obviously, are being very mindful about how to use AI, but how do you keep up with the business wanting to expand the use of AI, but then also supervising how those changes are made?
It goes to me in terms of, our sort of change management and governance process. I think about that question maybe in two buckets in terms of, adding tools, doing different things, making sure that, all of our information security checks, because obviously privacy, I think you guys talked about it with Holly last, the PII concerns are there. That to me is sort of going through governance, making sure that everyone understands, checking boxes, bringing in the right people. From a compliance and supervision perspective, I can share with you, when we built Money Coach, we also built a compliance filter on top of it. And so it's a sort of proprietary tool that we have that sits on and sort of analyzes every communication based on a compliance owned and written prompt, and runs every interaction through that, and then brings any alerts or sort of an exception report to a human, and that human on my team who then goes through and reviews it. To your point around scaling, that's something that we're talking about right now as we go and we have, more interactions and we have more quote unquote exceptions or violations. Do we look at going to sample based for human interaction? Do we look at tweaking the compliance prompt? To be fair, I would say probably 75 or 80% of something that is caught as a violation through the filter is actually a false positive, and we're able to then train right within our tools to say it's okay to say this. And just this morning, we were having conversations of, when we started building this tool, we were very conservative, very prescriptive, told the trainer meticulously review for these things. And we're now realizing, as the tool has evolved and the trainer has evolved, that we need to give a little bit more autonomy, if you will, to the analysis. And in my mind, I liken it to a new employee. You bring a new employee on and you're very careful. You give them all of the rules and you give them, strict oversight in terms of from a manager perspective. And as they become more seasoned and as they become more familiar with the business and they, have more day-to-day experience, they gain a little bit more of trust and autonomy. And that's sort of how we've evolved in terms of the compliance trainer. We go back and still do those reviews every day. Just as humans can make mistakes, the tool itself and the trainer can make mistakes. But I think the most important thing, as in, traditional supervision, is when you find a mistake, you train and you make sure that, you do everything you can to make sure it doesn't happen again.
That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds to me like the way you're using AI is really this idea that there's still quite a bit of human intervention, but it's assisted by AI. And so you can scale up further and faster.
I think that's right. I think of it as AI-assisted human efficiency, if that makes sense. And I have that conversation a lot with my team, because I think that a lot of compliance professionals and even lawyers, there's always the question of, AI will replace the need for humans. Absolutely not. And that's sort of how I think about it and talk to my team about it from a professional development perspective. It's not about replacing humans. It's about upscaling the work that the humans do. And I think a great example of it, and we talked about this earlier, is just that sort of investigative nature that some teams have to do, be it looking into, financial crimes investigations or looking into complaint responses. It's the hunting and pecking for information that usually can take a significant amount of time if you have your data in different systems. But AI, you can build, and we are experimenting now with some tools that will actually go out to those systems. You tell it what you need and where it needs to go for it, and it can go out to those systems and pull that information into what I call a report, which the human then goes, and the human can then go and look at the nuances, especially when it comes to things like transaction monitoring or complaint responses. Sometimes you need the human to know that knows the business to know where there could be some nuances there. But that is absolutely, in my view, the perfect use case of AI-assisted human efficiency.
Yeah, and Kate, that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, I'm going to steal that AI-assisted human efficiency. I really like it.
I give you permission. I give you permission.
But, to follow up on that, though, I know we've talked a little bit, about supervision, using AI externally with clients. And I know you had started talking also about kind of internal use, and as a CCO, how do you view that? We know that employees are using this technology, but also, can compliance officers use this technology, maybe for, different types of reporting purposes? Obviously, we have our Form ADV and other documentation. But I know you also mentioned transaction monitoring, and one of the things that we found that's really good about artificial intelligence, especially predictive, is that it is good at kind of taking this voluminous amounts of data, and kind of collating into something helpful for humans. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. As a digitally based fintech startup, we've been using forms of AI for quite some time for exactly those things. As you mentioned, we have 4 billion in assets under management, and 1.3 to 1.4 million subscribers. And so we've always had a lot of information and a lot of data since it's all entered through our app. What I've seen is the evolution of those things like transaction monitoring and, our fraud scenarios into more of that predictive and being able to give us a better view into who our clients are and what the behavior we should expect out of them is, and then where there are anomalies, if there is something that we would need to know about or be able to explain away. And so I do think that there has been a form of using AI of that, and many firms, have used it as well. But I think what's really sort of a key turning point and kind of where we're at now, it gets a little bit into sort of the future of AI in this industry, is that sort of more agentic use of AI, where you're training the AI to do a lot of the work that we all have done before in terms of looking at those transaction monitoring reports. And I think as a compliance officer, that's sort of where maybe my skeptic hat comes out a little bit again, just to understand like exactly how it's working, exactly what the model's doing, and to understand and make sure that we're not losing any of the quality of the human eye on it that you get, especially in circumstances of transaction monitoring or human behavior patterns.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And to follow up on what you just said, obviously looking forward, we could have a change in technology tomorrow. It always seems like a new systems coming out or a new model. But what do you see kind of coming down the road, for CCOs of investment advisors, in this space, even just 1 year from now, just kind of get your view on how. We've already seen how transformative it has been. How transformative do you think it will be?
I think it sort of will be incredibly transformative. I think the next year is exciting. I wish I knew what was coming. I wish that I had the vision to be able to see, because every day when something else happens, I'm like, wow, that's incredible. But harnessing that power and doing it in a way that not only is what's in the best interest of the end client and the firm, but in a reasonable and prudent manner, I think is super, super important. The future, I think, is going more towards this embedded AI within the sort of culture of companies and firms. We talk a lot about culture of compliance, and we've done that for years now. But I think that, for compliance officers, we need to be ready, willing, and able to understand how AI becomes part of that culture and not a distraction from that culture, and to use it. I personally think we'll see a lot more tools being developed out there. I get hit up a lot with vendors from vendors in terms of, their capabilities of AI. And I think that, I'm a little bit skeptical of that, because when you go and you actually look, it's really chatbots, and really those aren't the types of things that I think will evolve the compliance. So one thing, I'm always keeping a keen eye on is how is it actually being used and how is it evolving? I think the future, we will probably see more third parties doing much more of the, agentic, I think about it from a like horizontal versus vertical, the deep sort of full task done through AI, be that built internally or externally. And so I definitely think that that's the future. From a compliance officer perspective, I think the peril, or what we need to keep our eyes open on, is making sure that we understand what's happening, what the expectations are, and is it performing the way that we need to. I remember, at a mentor once who told me, every compliance officer needs to be a technologist, whether they want to be or not. And that means you have to understand technology in order to make sure that your compliance program is up to par and is, within the reasonable expectations of regulators and clients.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's not that a CCO needs to be a technologist, but they need to be able to have a conversation with all of their technology people in plain English in order to understand how technology is affecting the business, and in turn, how the CCO should be ensuring that the compliance structure is evolving alongside that.
That's 100% right. And when you think about it, think about it from a regulatory perspective. Your compliance officer is the first, point of contact with a regulator. If your compliance officer is unable to explain the use of AI and how it actually works within the firm, that will raise questions, as it should, from a regulator's perspective. And so that's where I've sort of embedded myself, or done the best that I can to embed a compliance perspective into any of the conversations, even strategically, on where we're going as a firm using AI.
So For CCOs who are not as deeply embedded as you are with the evolution of AI at their firms, what are some best practices you would recommend?
I think you start with asking questions. You start with sort of the premise that this is happening in terms of the evolution of AI. I think that compliance professionals, we don't do ourselves any favor if we try to sort of resist the evolution of it. I think that you have to ask the questions. You have to know and understand, to your point, Valerie, like it needs to be plain English. I can talk with my engineers all day, but they need to be able to explain it to me in a way that's translatable, not only for me to be able to explain it, but for me to be able to write policies and procedures around it as well. I think it's a reasonable regulatory expectation that you build all of these tool uses into your, policies and procedures. And so asking the questions to get that information, kind of doing an audit across the compliance program to understand where there's impacts of any, be it one tool, be it sort of a strategy of AI. There should be at least some recognition of the evolution and the use of these tools within firms, within your policies and procedures. We have an AI policy, which is employee facing. I know a lot of firms do, but it gives very explicit instructions and use cases, and it has sort of exception pathways as well. And I think about that in terms of if you're not recognizing that employees are using these tools, and you're not doing it in a way that is sort of enterprise-wide and applied that way in terms of approved tools and, closed tools versus open tools. None of us want any, public and open tools being trained with client data, for example. If you're not, tackling that head on, then I think it's you're sort of setting yourself up for what we've seen, recently with off-channel use of other communications and, having these issues sort of upfront and explained and trained employees on. We have an annual training that folks have to do, and we update that as we need to as well in terms of the use of AI. One other compliance issue that we all, have been faced with is sort of record keeping. What is a record? Where does it have to go? How is it kept? Is it a record for, business purposes that needs to be kept if, I'm just asking for a review of a paragraph that I have? Is it, obviously when you're talking about communications with clients, those are very, clear in terms of, SEC and FINRA requirements. But those are the types of things. It's not unlike sort of any other changes in business and programs or adaptation of a new vendor or a new system. Like those are sort of top of mind for me. It's just governance, policies and procedures, record keeping, and honestly, all built on a foundation of making sure that the compliance program and the compliance team are informed of what's happening.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think those are some great practitioner points for CCOs to think about.
Agreed. I think those are terrific takeaways, Kate. But one question I had too, though, is I know we've covered a lot of ground today, but was there anything else that you think maybe our audience would find helpful, or maybe something you found insightful, just kind of looking at this technology and how you use it?
Yeah, I think about it in terms of, as a compliance officer, obviously leading a team of compliance professionals, I see also the future, an evolution and sort of a talent adaptation that we will all sort of need to recognize and sort of support in, I have compliance officers who are now well-versed in these tools and looking, at, taking courses and taking certifications. It's not just the engineering teams that need to have these skills. And so I look at it as, I think I mentioned before, upscaling work of talent, but then also perhaps changing the profile of what a compliance officer in the future looks like. So that's always sort of top of mind for me. And I also think that, if I'm, sitting down and talking with someone who's never heard of AI, never used it before, where you start, I kind of go back to the basics again in terms of, what's your duty, what's your obligation to your clients, what's your regulatory obligations, and having a strong and solid foundation as it relates to what's guiding your use is really what helps drive our ability to move in this space. So yeah, those are really the things that I'm hoping that are resonating with other folks who are using it, but then also hoping to be tools for folks as they look at how their firms evolve. As I said, there's so many different use cases in terms of how firms are using this, and I'm sure next week there'll be a new use case, and when we talk about this in a year, there'll be hundreds of new use cases. But if you have that solid sort of consistent view and foundation and process to review use cases, review systems, and have sort of those supervisory obligations top of mind when thinking that through, I think it's reasonable. And really, we can't know everything and we can't be perfect all the time, but we can certainly, strive to have reasonable programs and reasonable use, as well as sort of that responsible use for our AI assisted humans. So
I think that's exactly right. And a great note for us to wrap up on. I don't have any more questions. William, do you have any more questions for Kate?
No more questions, Valerie, but I just wanted to again thank Kate. I know we've talked about this, but I always feel so much smarter after listening to all our expert guests that we get on the podcast. So Kate, again, thank you. This has been incredibly helpful.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. I always love the opportunity to talk about these things because they're evolving, and it's great to have conversations with other incredibly intelligent people who have thoughts and experiences as well. So,
well, thank you, Kate. This was wonderful. And for our listeners, until next time.